the words of prayer that begin our study. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We give thanks to the Creator and the Sustainer who helps us find our way into the deep waters of Torah. And let us enjoy our study together today. So we convene on Wednesday mornings. We're just doing like a mini-mester this August. We'll convene 10:15 to 11:45 today. I can't meet next week, as I indicated in an email to the class, with my apologies. We're doing an offsite senior staff retreat next Wednesday and Thursday, and we have an out-of-town facilitator, and I couldn't get the dates to line up not to include a Thursday. So I'll be otherwise occupied with work next Thursday, but we resume on the 18th and the 25th. Then we're on hiatus through Labor Day, the start of school, and the High Holy Days, and we'll resume midweek during Sukkot on October 13th, and we'll go all the way through just before Hanukkah, which is quote-unquote late this year. So every week we come together and we study a section or a few teachings from the Mishnah being the earliest compiled long-form document of rabbinic teaching, often mistakenly identified as a law code. Mishnah is instead a kind of organized super commentary on not just Torah, but especially on the ways, the ins and outs of living a Jewish life. So it is intended to be a kind of comprehensive guide to how to live a Jewish life, composed somewhere, or I should say compiled somewhere in the first part of the 3rd century of the Common Era. Its redaction is attributed to the greatest rabbi of his generation, Rabbi Judah the Prince, more commonly in Hebrew, Yehuda or Judah Hanasi. So Judah Hanasi or Yehuda Hanasi is, and sometimes he's so famous in his day that he is identified as just rabbi. So Judah Hanasi compiled Mishnah, a word that means teaching, one of many Jewish words that means teaching, sometime in the first part of the 3rd century. So like by 235, we believe, of the Common Era, Mishnah had been compiled in its familiar 6 orders, which are intended, again, thematically to organize all the dimensions of living a Jewish life. We began our study over 2 years ago on Thursday mornings. Actually, even, I think was it 2 years ago? Was it the beginning of the pandemic? I think that we were already in pandemic time. I don't know. I've completely lost track of time, space, and everything. But we began by studying Mishnah on Shabbat, the 9 chapters of the Mishnah on how Shabbat is observed, which is really a wonderful text to learn the mechanics of Mishnah. But we've spent the rest of our time doing a sequential deep read of Pirkei Avot, which is far and away the most famous, the most celebrated of all of the all of the chapters of the Mishnah, the tractates. Mishnah Avot, as I said before, is kind of like the Poor Richard's Almanac of rabbinic Judaism. It's a collection of wise sayings. We've examined its organizational principles. We do a little bit of the work in the Hebrew. Please don't be intimidated if you don't feel comfortable with Hebrew. It's my goal as the teacher and my job as the teacher to make the Hebrew accessible to all. And Mishnah by Mishnah, which is just another word of saying teaching by teaching or paragraph by paragraph, we go through the text. To catch us up where we were last time, we had begun and made some headway into chapter 5 out of 6. So we are approaching 5/6 of the way through Pirkei Avot, a word that means, by the way, or a title that means the chapters, Pirkei Avot, fathers, more aptly ancestors, possibly it means elders, or it could mean master chapters. Pirkei Avot could actually mean like the Big Daddy chapters, as opposed to referring to any specific avot or imahot, forefathers or foremothers. It could just mean big chapters. Whatever the intended meaning of Pirkei Avot, this text has come down to us as one of the most cherished in all of Jewish tradition, studied widely across the Jewish world. It is accessible on the surface, but incredibly deep and filled with layers of meaning that are ours to unpack as you go into the text. So we were picking up with chapter 5, which I explained before we went on hiatus, is organized as a series of numerical mnemonics. Numerical meaning organized around numbers. Mnemonics meaning devices that in this case use numbers to aid in memorization or to facilitate the internalization of what is being taught. We saw that the first several texts were, for instance, sequences or series of tens. There are 10 so-and-so, 10 generations from Abraham, from Noah to Abraham, for instance, and then it will allow the reader to remember the 10 and to use the numerical device as an aid for familiarization with the text and its meaning. So we did a lot of little paragraphs, mishnahs, on significant groupings of 10 in Pirkei Avot. And now today, we pick up with groupings of 7. So the text we're going to start with is exactly where we left off. And again, if you'd like to go back and review, all of these are on my YouTube channel. So if you just Google YouTube Rabbi Blake, all one word, Rabbi Blake is like my online handle in lots of different social media platforms. You'll see that you can find all of the classes. I think we've recorded over 33 of these so far, all online. So we're going to begin at the beginning of Mishnah Avot, Pirkei Avot, chapter 5, Mishnah number 8, as you can see here. For those of you who are need a refresher or who are joining us for the first time, the text that I'm using is the free online incredible database of Jewish texts, much in Hebrew, and much of it has been translated into English with innumerable commentaries. It really intends to become the comprehensive directory of all Jewish sacred texts, Sepharia, SEFARIA.org, as you can see up here in the URL bar. And then you can just search for what you're looking for inside of Sepharia. It's also good to have a printed copy of Pirkei Avot. Up on my shelf here, I have about, Pirkei Avot is one of those books where you can never have enough. So I probably have, I don't know, 8 or 9 different editions of Pirkei Avot. I'm just going to grab one over here, actually. I haven't used this much, but I have a 3-volume set of Pirkei Avot, chapter 5. So it's always good to have a hard copy out by you. Oh my goodness, this is why I ended up getting progressives. This is very small. Okay, so Pirkei Avot, chapter 5, verse 8. A caveat, however, if you are using a printed edition, often the numbers of the specific Mishnah that we might be studying do not correspond. Every edition of Pirkei Avot seems to do the numbering of the chapters and the Mishnayot, the individual paragraphs, slightly differently. So in Sepharia, this is Pirkei Avot 5:8. Shiva mine poranut. Just 3 words here. We'll start at the beginning. Shiva. Actually, even people who don't know a lot of Hebrew might find a familiar word here. Shiva, like Shiva. From the Hebrew number Sheva, which means 7. So Shiva is 7. Mine poranut, kinds of punishment. Ba'in la'olam, come into the world. Al, corresponding to, al is a preposition. Shiva gufei avera, sorry. So 7 bodies. A guf is a body, but in this case, it means categories of transgression. So again, switching to the English here, 7 kinds of punishment come into the world or come to the world for 7 categories of transgression. Let's just stop here and try to unpack the meaning of this first line. 7 kinds of punishment. Shiva mine puranut, a Greek loan word that means punishment. Ba'in la'olam, come into the world. Al, corresponding to or for. Shiva Gufei Avera, 7 kinds or bodies of transgression. So first of all, you have the mnemonic. You have the numerical use of 7, which is one of the most commonly deployed etiological numbers. An etiological number, ETIOLOGICAL. Etiological is a word that means the significance of the thing is beyond its numerical significance. It's not significant so much because it's the integer 7, but rather because 7 in Jewish tradition signifies something. Usually 7 means a complete set of something, going back to the 7 days of creation. Many of our holidays are in 7s. There are innumerable 7s throughout the Torah, the Tanakh, and later Jewish tradition. It is a number that the mystics would much later in the medieval period pick up and use frequently. And it inspired, among other things, the design of the sanctuary of Westchester Reformed Temple is a commentary on the number 7. So if you haven't been to the temple in a while, next time you're here, take a look in the sanctuary and see if you can figure out the significance of 7 in the sanctuary of WRT. But for our purposes, 7 kinds of punishment correspond to 7 categories of transgression. What is happening here? Like, what are the rabbis trying to set up? What underpins or underlies a blanket statement like that? Or if you don't feel comfortable venturing a guess of an answer to my question, what questions does that statement prompt in you? When you read with me 7 kinds of punishment come into the world corresponding to 7 kinds of transgression, what does that make you want to ask or know more about? You can either unmute yourself or use the digital hand function to chime in. I also happen to know this is not a bashful group, so I've learned that just if I wait a couple minutes, somebody will be brave and want to chime in. Judy Lass.
Yeah, I think that it sounds as if for this there is that, for everything there is a this, for everything there is a that.
Excellent. Excellent. Nicely put, elegantly put. And there's a Hebrew phrase that describes exactly what you have just proposed. It is called middah keneged middah. Middah with a mem. So mem yud dalet hey, middah, or M-I-D-A-H or M-I-D-D-A-H. Middah keneged middah means measure for measure, like the Shakespeare play. Middah keneged middah is a precept. I would call it a theological precept because it actually is a comment on how God works in the world that originates in biblical times, is most famously seen in the book of Deuteronomy, which we are beginning this week. Not, I'd say coincidentally, but it's kind of nice that the book of the Torah that is most associated with the idea, the concept, or the precept of middah keneged middah, for every this, there's a that, for every cause, there's an effect. Justice in specific is meted out measure for measure. What we do has a corresponding effect. And we begin with the negative in this Mishnah, punishment and transgression, or I should say, yeah, punishment and transgression. And interesting, by the way, that it starts with punishment and not the other way around, just because punishment is the effect, not the cause, right? 7 kinds of punishment come into the world corresponding to 7 kinds of transgression. And commenting here, just my interpretation is that A, isn't that intriguing? B, it strikes me that perhaps what the writers of Avot are suggesting is we human beings know the punishment. We don't always know what the transgression is. In other words, it is human nature to interpret that which happens, we might say, to us, that which happens to us in our lives as consequent to something we have done to invite it. This is a particularly Jewish and particularly biblical Jewish way of looking at the world. It is also, for many of us, I would say, particularly in a post-Holocaust milieu, it is particularly problematic, right? if you did not believe it before, for many Jews, the Holocaust, the Shoah, destroyed the idea that there could be measure for measure justice, because there could be no transgression of our people that warranted or merited or that could correspond to the horror, the massacre, the death, the bloodshed that was inflicted, the pain that was inflicted upon the Jewish people. Nevertheless, middah keneged middah, for every this, there's a that, as Judy puts it, or as I would say, measure for measure justice, that God's judgment of us is in direct correlation to and corresponds to what we do in the world. And again, it's interesting, we're focusing on the negative. This is an idea with legs. In other words, this is an idea that once part of the Jewish tradition becomes very hard to extirpate, to remove from the Jewish tradition. And for generations, Jewish people have tried to counter this argument that whatever we do has an equal and opposite divine reaction. If we transgress, then in equal measure, God will punish. And again, interestingly, and I think significant for us to pick up on the nuance here, that we actually start with the punishment. If one is experiencing something that we would interpret as a kind of punishment, it must correspond to something that we have done wrong, to an averah. Averah being the Hebrew word that is used in the first line of this Mishnah, meaning a transgression. All right, so that's the, and we're gonna, don't worry, I'm not getting off of this just yet, but I wanna make sure that we are deep into the theological swamp that this text invites us to enter. Alan, was that a hand up? No, okay.
No, it wasn't, but I thought you misspoke earlier when you said that we know what the punishment is, but we don't know what the transgression is. And then you repeated yourself, so I know it's not an error.
Well, I'm suggesting that it is provocative to start with the idea that there are 7 punishments. And my premise here for having said that, which it was intentional, I meant to say it, is that we always know how our life circumstances feel, right? So say you're a farmer. Oh, it was a scorching hot summer and all my crops burned and died. Kelly and I are looking out our back window every day and kind of lamenting the sad state of our hydrangeas. This has not been a good year for our hydrangeas. They're all brown. And that's because it's been a really hot summer. We can get into, by the way, cause and effect on hot summer, but that would be a significant rabbit hole that I don't quite yet want to go down. We'll probably touch on this. What we're going to be exploring, by the way, just taking a step back, speaking of rabbit holes, what we're really exploring today is a common theme of Pirkei Avot, which is the interplay between human action and divine action. What exactly is the relationship between human action and divine action? And what I'm proposing in my playing off of the observation that this text begins with punishment and only then proposes that there's a correlation to transgression and not the other way around, is that often in life we experience things that are consequential in a negative direction. My crops burned up this summer. One way in which Jewish people or Jewish theology has proposed a reason for this is that, well, you must have done something bad, as opposed to always knowing the bad thing we did that prompted a commensurate punishment. Okay, let's read on a little bit, and maybe this will, oh, Audrey, do you want to comment here? And then we'll look at like how this plays out, not just in the general one opening line, but in the specific as well. Just unmute yourself kindly.
It just seems that this is all so negative.
Yeah, it is.
And I think that you have that frequently in Judaism and through the prayers, through texts. And it makes it somewhat, I mean, they talk about Jewish guilt, right? But it also makes it a little, I think, harder to attract people or keep people.
Right. So this is, again, I'm interested in teaching this text I'm not necessarily interested in promoting it as a good way through a meaningful Jewish life in New York in 2022 or Cape Cod, wherever you may find yourself today. I think, and the other thing I'll say on that subject, Audrey, by way of agreeing with you, this is a text that doesn't necessarily warm the cockles of one's heart. It does not create a whole lot of positive motivation for participating in the Jewish project, the project of being and doing Jewish. It also is very much a demonstration of how embedded guilt, shame, transgression at the psychological level may be in Judaism historically. Like this, Jewish guilt is not a new thing.
No.
And a text that begins this way on the, just kind of the declarative statement that there are 7 different kinds of punishment, which again, don't read 7 as an integer, read it as a kind of symbol of meaning a full set, like every imaginable punishment, every imaginable bad thing that happens in your life correlates to one of 7 possible, meaning every imaginable kind of transgression. That's one legitimate read. Well, again, that doesn't exactly, if that's the only thing I know about what it means to be Jewish, that doesn't exactly make me want to go, learn how to bake a challah. Like if I'm an outsider to the tradition, I might say, maybe I want to go to a religion that's a little bit more inviting and a little bit less intimidating. But my goal here is not to indoctrinate or inculcate, it is to educate. And therefore, I think that it is helpful to see this text and also take some solace in the knowledge of something I alluded to a few minutes ago, which is that there are many concerted efforts to polemicize against this middah keneged middah, this measure for measure justice norm, which is so deeply embedded in the tradition. Remember that by the time the rabbis are writing and compiling the Mishnah, so the first centuries of the Common Era, Torah is a fact on the ground of at least between 500 and 800 years, right? So Torah, our scripture, our core text, and Tanakh has been around for many, many centuries. The idea of middah keneged middah, for every this, there's a that, or more specifically, when it comes to God's justice, it is meted out measure for measure. God's judgment of human beings and our behavior correlates to our behavior. That is a very old idea.
Yeah.
Though it may not be as old as the oldest parts of the Torah. It's interesting that Deuteronomy is probably a text, the core of which dates to the 6th and 7th, more like the 7th century BCE. So again, by the time the Mishnah is compiled, the book of Deuteronomy, the 5th book of the Torah, and 5th just means the order in which it is published, as it were, not necessarily the order in which it was written. Even with that, Deuteronomy is mid to late in the development of the literature that would eventually become the 5 books of Moses, relatively late, 7th century BCE, whereas the oldest material in the Torah may be between 1,000 and 1,200 years BCE. What that means is that, you have literature in the Torah that is between 1,500 and 1,000 years older than the redaction of the Mishnah. So you really have to kind of do the mental jujitsu of internalizing a very long, complex timeline for the development of this literature. Susan Ross. Just unmute yourself, my dear. Yep.
To pick up on what Audrey said about Jewish guilt and what you've said, is there anything positive and uplifting in what you're going to say today? I find that, with all due respect, that it seems rather depressing. And I wonder what the positive aspects of some of what you're going to say today or in the future.
I greet your comment with a smile and as an invitation or a wish. There's this wonderful Jewish tradition that whenever you are learning Torah, teaching Torah, reading Torah, and by Torah, I don't just mean the 5 books of Moses, I mean accumulated Jewish wisdom. And this is all Torah, right? When Pirkei Avot is Torah in the largest sense. Whenever you are studying, learning, publicly reading Jewish text, you always have to end on what's called a nechemta. Nechemta is an Aramaic word, so it was the spoken vernacular for much of Jewish life in antiquity. Nechemta comes from the Hebrew word nacham or nachum. Some of you may have met a Jewish person named Nahum. It's the root that, or nechama, it means comfort. So you always end your Torah on a note of comfort. So Susan, this is the challenge. We have to get to something that's going to comfort us and not just disturb us. And when I teach, I try to bring that into my teaching. It's like, you never want to end a Haftarah in particular, where the custom is particularly strictly practiced. You never end a Haftarah on a despondent note. And there are lots of Haftarot where the chapter that you're reading ends on a despondent note. It's like, and thereby God will smite you until you are no more. And then what are you going to do? Say Shabbat Shalom and have some schnapps? It doesn't work that way. So what the rabbis did was they said, we're going to make sure that you get to read like 2 extra lines, either sequentially or sometimes even non-sequentially. It's like, let's just throw in 2 lines that say, but God will take you back in love. Shabbat Shalom, let's have some schnapps, right? That's how this works. So you don't end on, and God will smite you, have a nice day. All right, let's try. Bill Shore, your comment, please. And then Judy last, and then we'll move forward. Going once.
Oh, I typed it, but I'll just read it. Does this imply that like punishments correspond to like transgressions?
That's where we're going to go with this.
Right. If you and your neighbor both suffer the same
right.
punishment, did you both do the same wrong thing?
Right. Thank you for anticipating where we're going, which provides us with a meaningful segue and the kind of impetus to move forward. So after Judy's comment, we will. Both are true. We're going to have an opportunity immediately forthcoming right now to examine not just, actually what's interesting is we're going to see this text that we're looking at today is not actually the correlation that is proposed between punishment and transgression is not so much for the individual, it is for the collective. You and your neighbor, or all of your neighbors in the Jewish collective. We'll talk about what that means. And then we will also examine in what ways, if at all, does the punishment correlate, I would say, in terms of like tone, content, mood, style with the transgression. Right? Is it in any way correlated, or is it if I steal a cookie from the cookie jar, you know, I break out in boils? Like that's not it's a bad punishment. It might disincentivize me from taking more cookies out of the cookie jar, but it doesn't necessarily correlate to the punishment. Better would be, you know, he who steals cookies from the cookie jar will be cursed with obesity. Okay, right. Okay, that correlates. Will be cursed with a severe chocolate chip allergy. Okay, let's find out. Judy, your comment, and then we'll move forward, please.
I just, like, it seems to me that if this is supposed to be wisdom, there's something significant here, and that people do need to be reminded that for every cause there is an effect. And if we're interested in ethical behavior, I mean, not that you should be frightened to death to know that you shouldn't steal the cookies from the cookie jar, but I think that there's an important message that people could inter, because I guess in 3rd century BC, people might be more frightened that God would come down and say, "Poof." Right. But I think it's a long-term important message that people do need to know. In the freedom of choice, you're responsible.
Right. And you remember, like, what you're saying, Judy, is a very helpful summary of some of the macro themes that we've been looking at throughout our study of Pirkei Avot. What does it mean to live an ethical life, a life of virtue? Remember also that the intended audience of Pirkei Avot is consistently rabbis or rabbis in training, young yeshiva buchers, young men, adolescent males who had some Torah under their belts and who specifically were being trained in the way of the rabbinate to become teachers of the law, adjudicators of Jewish principles, you know, to act as in the role of judge. So we talked about this a lot before our Memorial Day break. that the two core functions of the ancient rabbinate then, and in some ways even now, were to adjudicate matters of Jewish law and to teach Jewish law, right? To teach and judge. On my ordination certificate across the office over here, where is it? I'm going to knock some books off my shelf trying to turn my computer, so forgive me. But it says, this person, this rabbi may teach and he may judge. Those are the two qualifications that a rabbi is given in the Talmud. And that is consistent with how Pirkei Avot understands the role of the rabbi. So a lot of this text may be not so much for the hoi polloi, for the common people, but rather for the hyper-literate rabbis in training who had to take on the community, the responsibility to be the teachers and Jewish judges for the community. And in that role, particularly of judge, the rabbis were very much invested in the business of promoting ethical behavior. I'm just looking over here at this 3-volume set of Pirkei Avot, which I hadn't even cracked the bindings on. We did like a library clean out of the office this summer, and I found a bunch of stuff just sitting on shelves. So this one still has the price tag on it. And I'm like, oh, I'll take that. And it's an Orthodox publication from Art Scroll, which does a lot of, I'm sure Alan Markowitz has an Art Scroll Siddur somewhere on his shelves. But this one says Pirkei Avot, or it doesn't say Pirkei Avot, it says Pirkei Avos, like in the old Ashkenazi pronunciation, the sage's guide to living. That's their idea, right? So that's what this is. This is a guide to living, and one way to motivate proper behavior in the eyes of the rabbis is to remind people that their actions have consequences. Let us proceed. So we're looking at now, we're going to go a little bit further in. 7 categories of punishment, 7 categories of transgression. Miktsatan ma'asrin umiktsatan einan ma'asrin, which means when a group of people gives tithes, when some of them, meaning some of the people, give tithes, but I would say not and, but others do not give tithes, what is the consequence? Ra'av shel batsoret ba'a. A famine on account of drought will come. Ra'av shel batsoret ba'a. A famine on account of drought will come. We're going to read a little bit more just to see what you think the correlations might be. That's one on the Bill Shore comment question. What is the correlation in the kind of punishment with the kind of transgression? And 2, what is the relationship between the individual, or among the individual, the collective, and the divine? How do these all play together? So in a group, it is presumed miktsatan, and some give tithes. Ma'asrin, by the way, if you're good on Hebrew, this word ma'asrin here, the root of it is ayin, sin, resh, eser, which is the Hebrew for the number 10. A tithe is literally a 10th portion. Ma'asrin means to give a 10th. So you are tithing a 10th. Umiktsatan einan ma'asrin. So you have a group where some are tithing and some are not tithing. Ra'av shel batsoret ba'a. A famine on account of drought will come. Miktsatan re'evin umiktsatan sve'in. When they have, it will say, a famine from drought comes, some go hungry, and others will be satisfied. So this is interesting. This is beyond transgression and punishment. This goes into, and as a result, here is a consequence, right? So the order would be, you have a community. Some people are dutifully giving a 10th portion of their income, whether in money or in crops, to the Jewish community, to the temple, to the priest. It's not clear exactly what the collection structure that is being referenced here means, but it is clear that in the ancient rabbinic community, as in the biblical literature, tithing is an important part of Jewish life and sustaining community welfare. So in a community where some are tithing and some are not tithing, you can expect that you will experience famine on account of drought. And where there is famine, this is fascinating, by the way, some will go hungry, others will not go hungry. I'm fascinated by what is being suggested here. I should say I'm fascinated by what is being said here. I am also fascinated by what is not being said here. Let's read to the end of this Mishnah and see what other meaning we can make of it. And I'm going to switch over to the English. When they have all decided not to give tithes. So if you have a community where everybody says, you know what, it's been a hard year. stocks are down, inflation is up. This community this year is not giving tithes, right? Sorry, the temple sent its renewal forms, and everybody at Westchester Reformed Temple says, sorry, we've had a hard year. It's been a pandemic. I have been out of work. I can't support the temple this year. You know that that's bad for the temple. Like if everyone were to decide that, that's going to be a tough year for our Mishnah class. Okay, when they have all decided not to give tithes, a famine from tumult and drought comes. And the word, by the way, for tumult here, gamrusha lo la'aser, if they resolve not to tithe, ra'av shel mehuma, which means like a riot or public unrest. Vishel batzoret ba'a. So there's going to be some, and it's an ambiguous word. So unrest, distress, here they have tumult. There will be a really bad famine. And it goes on, this is in brackets, which means it's not actually in the text, but it is implied. When they have in addition decided not to set apart the dough offering, there's a word for that dough offering that you will recognize, et hachala, chala, meaning that word right there that I've highlighted, chala. Challah is not in the traditional literature. It is not yellow braided egg bread. Challah is the offering of dough that is taken particularly before the Sabbath bread is baked, and that is set aside and burned or cooked fully and not eaten. It is a symbolic way of saying this bread belongs to God and not only to me and my family. So in a community that has decided not to tithe, and not to do the traditional challah offering. Because remember, in a community, in a subsistence agricultural economy, every little bit counts. You wouldn't voluntarily give up good edible food, but that's part of Judaism. You give up things that you could otherwise derive benefit from. If you also refuse to set apart the dough offering, an all-consuming famine comes. Pestilence comes to the world for sins punishable by death, according to the Torah. So there's any number of those, obviously murder, rape and incest, various crimes that involve assault, kidnapping may incur capital punishment, but which have not been referred to the court. In other words, if somebody, as it were, has an outstanding murder charge against him or has committed murder and it hasn't even come to the court's attention, has, as it were, gotten away with it, and for neglect of the law regarding the fruits of the sabbatical year, what will happen? The community will experience pestilence, disease, okay? The sword, meaning warfare or enemy attack, comes to the world for the delay of judgment and for the perversion of judgment. So if you have pressing cases that you are, for whatever reason, dilly-dallying around, not hearing, or for perversion of justice, whatever that may entail, and because of those who teach the Torah not in accordance with the accepted law. What will happen? Enemies will decimate you. Okay, this is really going to be hard for any group of post-Holocaust Jews, in my view, except the most extreme opinions in Jewish life. And I will tell you that even today, there is a disturbing trend in certain extremist fringes of the Jewish world. I'm talking in parts of the Haredi world. I don't even want to paint with a broad brushstroke all Haredi Jews. But there are still some Haredi Jews who will teach, for instance, that the reason the Holocaust happened is because of one or more of the following. Jews who split away from traditional observance and became Reform. So there are still sects and individuals in Haredi Jewish life, ultra-Orthodox Jewish life, not all, but some, who believe and who teach that God sent the Holocaust as punishment for Reform Jews. Another is that God sent the Holocaust as punishment for Jews who became totally secular, not Reform, which many ultra-Orthodox Jews believe is a worse transgression than becoming an apostate. An apostate meaning just a non-practicing, I walk away from the tradition entirely. For some ultra-Orthodox Jews, Reform is a worse transgression. Again, this is hard for me to say as a person who's deeply in love with Reform Judaism, teaches Reform Judaism for a living. Nevertheless, understands historically that reform for some ultra-Orthodox Jews is worse than just walking away because we claim to be fully Jewish and we claim that our Judaism is fully Judaism, right? That's worse than just walking away and non-practice. And finally, there are some ultra-Orthodox Jews who claim that God sent the Shoah, the Holocaust, as a punishment for Zionism, for the audacity to deign that we could recreate a sovereign state in our biblical Holy Land without the Messiah coming, without the rebuilding of the temple, without God directing the action. For some ultra-Orthodox Jews, that was a transgression that merited the punishment of the Holocaust. So I want to suggest that, again, as we look at this, do not think that this is just some abstraction of almost 3,000 years in the past. It continues to reverberate in very, for us, I think, painful and uncomfortable ways. This idea of God punishing the people, either individually or more, we're seeing here collectively, for things that we may not even regard as transgressions, or transgressions that we may not feel suit the punishment that is suggested here. Mara Steiner.
So I'm having a little bit of trouble separating the individual transgression from the group transgression. If I don't give money to poor people, does something happen to me as opposed to my whole community stop doing this and the whole community suffers?
So this is, I think, one of the most interesting dimensions. And again, gratitude to you for raising the discomfort that you feel. Gratitude to Bill Shore for asking the question so that we could really understand that it is one of the big questions we're here to look at today. And obviously, I'm much more interested in asking good questions and exploring good questions than I am with providing, straightforward or simple answers to them. I don't know if there are any straightforward or simple answers. What I do think is that the emphasis here is on the collective, right? The emphasis is that in a community where some are doing the right thing and some are not, everyone experiences punishment. In other words, the effect is deleterious on the entire community welfare. One could argue that whether or not you take this measure for measure punishment and reward system, and we're not even talking about reward, though there is a correlating or a corresponding reward section to biblical literature. The book of Deuteronomy makes it clear that not only curses, which is typically the biblical word for punishment, will correlate to bad behavior or falling away from the covenant with God. It also says there are blessings for doing the right thing. If you follow God's law, all these nice things will happen. Though it's interesting, the blessings in the Torah, in the book of Deuteronomy that we've just begun this week, tend to be very kind of general categories. Blessed will you be in the city and blessed will you be in the country. Blessed will be your crops and blessed will be your vineyards. Like it's these nice poetic things. But when it gets to the curses, it is so elaborate, so detailed, and so extensive. They're like verse after verse, dozens of verses about all the bad things that could happen. And it's not general. It's like, you will be forced into a state of starvation and privation so severe that mothers will begrudge sharing the placenta, the afterbirth, when they give birth, because they need it to feed themselves. Like that is an actual verse from the book of Deuteronomy, by the way. Like that's an example of a biblical curse, which again, it's sort of like when I was in driver's ed in high school and they really wanted us to pay attention to the road. They would show us horrific videos of all the things that can go wrong if you're not paying attention or if you're high or if you're drunk or whatever. And it's these grisly videos, right? But they never show you getting a medal for following the speed limit, right? It's like, it's kind of just assumed. The good behavior is like, yeah, the reward is that you live. But woe unto him or her who disobeys. So that's sort of my Mara response here. The comment that Audrey raises, by the way, in the chat box is worth raising. If that is the case, if we know this about the Haredi who are so staunch in their anti-Zionism, why are there Haredi living in Israel, is one of the most vexing conundrums of modern Jewish life. That there are ultra-Orthodox Jews who believe that the state of Israel is illegitimate, but who nevertheless live in Israel. I don't have an answer for it. I'm sure that they have their own internal community justifications for this, quite possibly that they are there so that they can be first in line when the Messiah does come to overthrow the illegitimate government of the secularists in Israel and establish God's reign on earth, and that they're with where they need to be. But in the meantime, they will, in innumerable ways benefit from the provisions of the Israeli government and society and social welfare system. It's very problematic. But by the way, don't ask us to fight in the army. Even that has shifted a lot over the last years. Audrey, you're not the only one who is raising an eyebrow about this. The majority of Israeli society is deeply vexed by the small percentage of very outspoken Haredi Jews who, on the one hand, deem that the state of Israel is illegitimate and the government of Israel especially is illegitimate, but we'll live here in the meantime and profit and basically benefit from the labor of other people while we study Torah all day.
So on that, Rabbi Blake, because you said something just a moment ago, and even that comment about the Haredi, like when you said, if I do the right thing, but the others in my community don't, we are all punished, or, we all transgress. And it kind like the first thing that came to mind was working in a group project. Like you're in a group project and there's always the slacker, like there just is, but what ends up happening is becomes this resentment to say, well, I don't want to not do well on this project because you're not pulling your weight. So I'm going to resent you, but I'm going to step up more and I'm going to finish it.
Exactly.
So, and I feel like you could say that throughout, in any group setting, there's always the people who are willing to put in the extra work, put in the extra step, go do the above beyond, seatbelt, drive the speed limit, because there's other people on the road who aren't paying attention. And the question is, why do we do that if ultimately we're all going to pay the price, of the transgressors or those who are not willing to pull their weight?
I'm so with you on this. So you gave me a meaningful opportunity to respond by way of sharing another text. This is another thing rabbis do. So bear with me. Thank you for the comments here, Stephanie. I think they're right on where we need to be focusing our energies today. So look on the screen. I've called up on the screen Vayikra Rabbah, which is another, by the way, long form possible course of study that I'd love to teach at WRT. I have to find a way to make the title appealing because it's Midrash on the book of Leviticus. But if ever there were a book of the Torah in need of Midrash, if ever there were a book of the Torah that is arcane and a little bit hard to approach, the book of Levitical sacrifices and priestly norms would be it. And the rabbis writing in their own imaginative, expansive way about this book is really wonderful. So this is a famous story. You may even have heard it because it is one of the more popular midrashim. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai taught a parable. Men were on a ship. One of them took a drill and started drilling underneath him. The other said to him, what are you sitting and doing? He replied, what do you care? Is this not underneath my area that I am drilling? They said to him, but the water will rise and flood us all on this ship, right? So I'm just drilling underneath my seat. Pay no attention to me. That is not actual. So this is a kind of wonderful midrash about the meaning of living in community. And even as a rising tide lifts all boats, a drill under one person's seat sinks the entire ship. So, and I think that remember, Judaism is a communal practice. It is not a hermetic, monastic practice primarily focused on individual spiritual development. It is rigorously, consistently focused on the spiritual and physical well-being of a community. So I think that's an important takeaway. Whether or not you accept, as I do not accept, the measure for measure justice aspect that informs this text, which again is the better part of 1,000 years old by the time the Mishnah is redacted. So the Mishnah is still a product of not only its time, but also the tradition that comes before it. And there's ample tradition to suggest that this is how God's justice works in the world. You do something wrong, God sends a corresponding punishment. You experience a punishment in the world, as it were. You experience some misfortune, would probably be the word, something that goes wrong or awry in your life or in the life of your community. You must have done something wrong. In this case also, because it's impossible to know everything about every individual's behavior, whereas it is possible to make certain conjectures about communities. After all, I think that what's unspoken in this text is the awareness that in any community, you will have people who are faithful to the law and people who lack faith in the law. You have people who are rule followers and people who are rule breakers. And I think that with that being known, you therefore always have a built-in explanation for when things go wrong. Because it would never be the case that everyone in the community is following every rule down to the last jot and tittle, right? So now it makes it possible for the rabbis to explain that, well, somebody or some bodies must not have been punctilious in following the laws of tithing, which, by the way, are about not hoarding wealth. If I were not in my teacher mode as a rabbi, but rather in my preacher mode, I were here to write a sermon, I would probably find this a rich text to talk about the scourge of growing income inequality in society, or inequality in general. And the idea that, yes, it is true that, you know, an individual may be able to transgress and get away with it, but ultimately there is a cumulative effect on society for bad behavior, particularly in terms of what we do with our wealth. And if we are more interested in hoarding our wealth than in sharing it, or we are not at all invested in sharing our wealth with those who need it more, which is what tithing is really all about. It's not just about supporting the religious institutions, it's about supporting the indigent in the community. That was the purpose of tithing, both biblically and in the rabbinic era, at least to a partial extent. If it were not, and I'm sorry, I hear some drilling. They're doing some HVAC work in the office today, so maybe I'll teach at home next time.
Don't sink the ship.
Don't sink, exactly. Exactly. They're drilling right behind my wall over here. It's really funny. That's really funny. That collective behaviors are important, and they inform certain collective consequences. And that's why the focus here is fairly consistently on the collective and not on the individual transgressor, right? And I'll pull the text back up so we can see that. Audrey, you want to make a comment before we move on? Unmute.
I thought this passage, when we were reading about the tithe, if you put a positive spin on it, it talks or it speaks to the importance of being charitable.
Right.
And in that regard, when it struck me that if you didn't give your portion of the dough that's to be set aside, instead of burning it, and you have a situation of a drought, shouldn't that be given to those who are suffering starvation?
Always. And by the way, if you have a situation where life is threatened, you never burn your food. You always share it. But look, some of this is not just about tithing for the benefit of the poor or the indigent or the hungry. It is also tithing to demonstrate your allegiance to, your fealty, your submission before God, right? And that is one of the things that binds the community in a common purpose. Again, I'm teaching about these Jewish norms. I'm not necessarily asking that we subscribe to them, but it is helpful to understand what is meant by these practices. There's more. Okay, so we're going to go into the next Mishnah, which is a direct continuation. We'll just stick with the English. Wild beasts. Like, remember, there are 7 kinds of punishment. So most of these begin with the misfortune that is experienced and then propose the transgression that may have been perpetrated by or within the community that brought this about. So we've talked about the sword, which is a kind of a wonderful metonym. Metonym is a word that I use a lot. It's like the White House said today. The White House didn't say anything. The White House is a building in Washington, D.C. That means the government or the administration of Joe Biden. The White House said. The Crown declared. No, the Crown didn't say anything. The Crown is on a shelf in the Queen's bedroom. I don't know where it is, but it's somewhere in Buckingham Palace. The sword means enemy attack, war, unprovoked, presumably. And war, you'll remember, the sword comes into the world for the delay of judgment. So if you pervert justice as a society, as a collective, the result is that you will be attacked from outside. I don't know. It could also mean civil unrest. You'll be attacked from inside, right? We could say that the justice long deferred, long delayed, long denied to the African American community in recognition of the horror of slavery and the abuses of the Black population of America from the minute they were brought over here in chains through the hundreds of years of their enslavement of Black bodies to the abuses of Jim Crow on through segregation and the subtle ways in which segregationist ideologies have made their way into school districting and ability of Black folks to, live in the same neighborhoods as white folks. All of those things we might say are justice denied, justice deferred, justice perverted. And the result, if you want to be really literally consistent with this text, would be violent civil unrest. The sword. The sword could just mean violence. It doesn't mean that people are taking up metal blades, right? It doesn't necessarily mean enemy attack, which was where my brain went first. It's open enough, it's ambiguous to know, to mean perhaps the ultimate consequence of gross perversion or gross deferment, delay of justice is violent unrest. The Civil War, as a result of the inability of the Union to hold around whether or not Black people would have a full share in the American project or not, or only 3/5. All right, so I'm using some examples where more in my preaching role, if I were tasked with writing a sermon that used this text of Pirkei Avot, which I'm with many of you, I'm sympathetic to your discomfort because there are a lot of things that I do not believe about measure for measure justice. And the idea that, for instance, something like the Holocaust, which was the greatest misfortune in all of Jewish history, could in some way correlate to a transgression perpetrated by even a large percentage of the Jewish people is so theologically obnoxious to me that, but as my friend Rabbi Shai Held often says, anytime you bring up the Holocaust or Hitler, it ruins the analogy. It ruins the ability to make an analogy because it's so sui generis. It's so unique, right? It is unique. It is a singularity in Jewish life, and you can't analogize around it. Okay. Wild beasts. You're an ancient community. A leopard infestation. Now, I don't know exactly what wild beast. Jackals, maybe. Coyotes. We had some coyotes during the pandemic. Do you remember that? And bears. We had bears in Scarsdale. It was crazy. We had a bear like 3 blocks from our house I think in like June or May of 2020 during lockdown when cars weren't scaring off all the animals. All the like scary animals came out to play in the suburbs. Okay, wild beasts come into the world for swearing in vain. Now here's one where I say to someone like Bill Shore, I have no idea what the hell that has to do with anything. And for the profanation of the name. Sidebar, this idea of taking God's name in vain does not just mean deploying a swear word around God's name. Primarily, this has to do with the biblical and rabbinic ideas around the seriousness of making a vow on God's name. So it was customary throughout the biblical period and into the rabbinic period that if you wanted to signify that you meant your promise, that your promise was to be taken as a solemn oath, that you would swear it on God's name. Very much analogous to even modern day American court proceedings where a hand is placed on a Bible. Do you swear that you will tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Often they add, so help you God. That's what's meant here. Swearing in vain means you didn't really mean it, right? You weren't prepared to go through with it, and yet you invoked God's name. The idea and the reason that this is considered such a serious transgression in biblical times, as in the rabbinic literature, as in the rabbinic period, is because the very name of the divine was believed to have almost supernatural power. God's name itself is more than just a collection of letters and cannot be spoken even casually, which is the entire platform or bedrock on which many Jewish customs around the divine name are based. All the way from reading Yud He Vav He as Adonai, which just means my master. you don't actually say the name of God, which is Yahweh, or as my meditation teacher says, Yud He Vav He are 4 letters that have no vocalization. They're just the sound of breathing. So the name of God is breath. It is the sound of your breathing, which I think is an incredible and wise understanding of how our tradition understands the divine. Divine is the life force, right? The breath. And if you invert those letters, Yud He Vav He, and spell them He Vav Yud He, they spell Havaya, which means existence. So God is more than just a kind of like figurine that you put on a shelf, or anything that can be drawn or imaged, much beyond that. But even still, the discomfort around saying Yud He Vav He or Yahweh in a liturgical prayer context and not just in a class leads us to say Adonai instead, leads people to say Adoshem, which means nothing. It means like the name, or Hashem, which literally means the name, or Elokeinu instead of Eloheinu. On my tallis, if you look on the back of your tallis, it actually doesn't say Eloheinu melech haolam, it says Elokeinu melech haolam, because God forbid we should actually write out the name God, which leads people in the last 100 years to say, I won't even write G-O-D, I'll just write G-D, which is a custom I actually really don't like. I think it's ridiculous. God is a perfectly acceptable, neutral name for talking about God. You don't need to put a dash in the middle. It's not like you're saying God's proper name, Steve, or something like that. It's God. God is God. I'm fine without the dash. But if that's your jam, more power to you. So what does wild beasts have to do with using God's name in vain? I have no idea. If you want to make a guess, that's fine, but I might have to suppress the impulse to roll my eyes, because I just am not sure that we can make a logical correlation between swearing in vain, profaning God's name, and having an infestation of coyotes in our backyard. Like, I don't think so, but okay. Exile comes into the world. This is probably the Jewish misfortune. They use the word punishment, I use the word misfortune, with which the people of the rabbinic era were most painfully familiar. Exiled twice. First, when the Romans destroyed the temple, or multiple times, but I'm saying in the more immediate recollection of the rabbinic Jewish community, exiled when the Romans destroyed the temple and eventually vanquished the Jewish rebellion in the years between 70 and 73, 74, with the fall of Masada. That concluded one chapter. Again, after the Bar Kokhba revolt, when the rebellion was crushed and Jews were sent into diaspora, dispersion, exile. Galut in Hebrew. Here it's mini-mester ani shebash. Oh, where I'm looking for the word for galut. Avodah zarah. Galut. Here it is. Galut ba'a. Galut is exile. Some people will still use the Yiddish form of that word, which is golus. Golus, which means exile. We're living here in golus. If you're not living in Israel, then you're in golus. You're in galut. Exile comes into the world for idolatry. So why were the Jews scattered? Not because the Roman armies were superior in both the destruction of the temple, in the Judean revolt in the 70s, not because the Romans were superior to Bar Kokhba and his followers, but rather because we, the Jews, offended God by worshiping idols.
Oh, shit.
Also, it took more than that to exile us. Also, for sexual sins and for bloodshed. Sexual sins meaning rape and incest, and bestiality, and any of the other transgressions that the Bible identifies as sexual crime, and for transgressing the commandment of the year of the release of the land, which here in the Hebrew, just so you know what's being referred to, bloodshed, hashmatat haaretz, the Shemitah year, which is the 7th year in which the land was required to lie fallow. Just as people have a sabbatical, agriculture experiences what's called a Shemitah. Interestingly, we are in the last 7 weeks, just about 7.5 weeks of the Hebrew year 5782. This year has been a Shemitah year. This has been a land sabbatical year. And there are some kibbutzim, some agricultural collectives in Israel that have actually observed a fallow year. They did not plant nor sow. Okay. And more on this, just so we get it, and then we'll have a chance to chat until the end of our class, I think. At 4 times, pestilence increases. In the 4th year, in the 7th year, and at the conclusion of the 7th year. Okay, so the 4th year in biblical, there was a sequence of 7 years in the agricultural cycle of biblical Israel, which the rabbis at least memorialize in their writing. Not clear whether or not this was agriculturally practiced, but as I've said, there are even some modern kibbutzim that do practice these biblical practices around sacred agriculture. The 4th year was the year for setting aside a special tithe for the poor. The 7th year was the Shemitah year, the year of lying fallow. And it says here at the conclusion of the 7th year, the conclusion of the Feast of Tabernacles, that is Sukkot, in every year. So when are we most likely to experience an outbreak of pestilence or disease? According to this, in the years where you are not, where you are reserving crops for the poor, and every year at Sukkot time. Why? I have no idea. In the 7th year, it says, on account of the tithe of the poor, which is due in the 6th year. At the conclusion of the 7th year, on account of the produce of the 7th year. And at the conclusion of the Feast of Tabernacles, meaning Sukkot, in every year for robbing the gifts to the poor. I think my read on this is that and I'm happy to hear your thoughts too, because I found this text confusing. I think what Pirkei Avot is suggesting here is that in years where you are either times of the year when you are harvesting, or years when you are specifically commanded to give to the poor, that is when the community is most vulnerable to hoard as opposed to share. And as a result of hoarding, when we are supposed to share our wealth, pestilence comes as a punishment. I think that's what's being communicated here, but I don't know because I'm just a reader of the text just like you are. Do you have any thoughts on anything we've read so far today now? So for the last 15 minutes, I'd like to open this up for a bigger conversation because we've actually covered a lot of ground. I've done a lot of the talking. I'm eager to hear from you, your thoughts, your responses, your questions. What does this land? How does this land for you? What does this bring up for you? You can just begin talking, and because I don't see all your hands. I think I do see Judy Lass's hand.
I have a question. It seems to me, just as I was thinking about it, the wild beasts that come into the world, could they not possibly be likened to the worst of our attributes that come out of us when we maybe aren't doing ethical behaviors, when we're not caring totally about whether we drill under our seats so the whole community drowns or not? And I would agree with you also that in the periods of time we're supposed to leave our gleanings at the edges, and we're supposed to take care of the poor in the Jubilee year in the 7th year. When we don't do it, even because it's much more, in its own way, it's much more didactic. This is what you have to do this year instead of what you're going to do any other year. I think that might also be almost connected to that's the part of ourselves that's a little selfish. We may not be bears or coyotes, right, but we're not being ethical humane.
Right. First of all, beautiful comment. Beautiful, appropriate, wise, and suitable for the way in which modern Jews might read this text and through the power of metaphor, extract meaning. As a lover of metaphor myself, as a lover of the rabbinic attention to metaphor, metaphor making, metaphor expanding, and as a one-time English literature major who concentrated in poetry, I think having a rich capacity for metaphor is a useful skill for living a rewarding Jewish life. If your Jewish life includes study of text. So yes, and this is not a but, it's an and. And one who reads this text only as metaphor, I think needs to be committed to the idea that if you're going to suggest that within one Mishnah, within one paragraph, if you read one line as a metaphor, you probably should be willing to read the whole thing as a metaphor. In other words, I think it's intellectually, it lacks intellectual rigor to say, whenever I so choose, I'll read this statement literally, but this statement right next to it metaphorically. Right? In other words, I think if you want to take the whole thing as a metaphor for whether it is the collective responsibility or the responsibility of the collective to lead a life of virtue, I think there's a lot in here too about regulating behaviors in ancient society that could not be policed, but you could put in the psychological threat of your community will suffer if you are not fully attentive to these things, because otherwise there's not a whole lot of intrinsic motivation to do the things that are being suggested in the two Mishnahs we looked at today, because they require that a person is willing to give away something of value to him or her at the individual level. And what is being suggested here is, yeah, but if you do that, if you hoard instead of sharing with the poor, if you neglect your responsibility to the community in various ways, the whole community will suffer. So what is being inculcated here is an all for one and one for all. That's fine. And that does not require that you read this as a metaphor. I think that's actually a pshat, a surface logical reading of the text. When you get into what exactly informs the punishments and the crimes, like how do you account for the association between failure to, what was it, and wild beast, or failure to honor your vows using God's name, profaning the divine name, and being attacked by a horde of jackals? Like, I have no idea where that comes from. But okay, again, there's almost, it seems almost desperate to me, but there is this thoroughgoing effort to suggest that individual behaviors have community consequences in the aggregate, right? So if we were all, if we all failed to make our vows with integrity, if we all lacked integrity when it came to vows, often, by the way, vows using God's name were promises of money to the community or the religious establishment, right? We do that at WRT when we do like an endowment campaign or a capital campaign. We don't go to somebody's house and say, by the way, we'd like you to give $10,000 to Lech Lecha, which is what we did 15 years ago, by the way, just in case you think we just asked you for money. And people are like, you just asked me for a contribution. I'm like, yeah, 15 years ago when we built the building. But we don't say, okay, give us $10,000 now. We'll say, well, could you make a pledge that you would give us $5,000 a year for 2 years, or $3,300 a year for 3 years? And most people make good on their pledges. Some people don't. If an entire community does not make good on its vows, then everyone suffers, right? Then you don't get to build the community institutions you're trying to build. That's my ham-fisted metaphor, and a pitch to be philanthropically supportive of your Jewish community and synagogue. Right. People are like, Rabbi, stick to Torah, please. Other comments here? All right, well, that means that you're grasping this. And I appreciate that, because these, I think, are particularly challenging Mishnayot to grasp. And that means that we can go to the Nechemta, a la Susan Esther Ross, who said, aren't we going to end on something that's comforting? So we get to read number 10, which is one of my all-time favorite Mishnayot. But it's actually one of my all-time favorite texts. I teach this text to anyone at any time, in any circumstance. It is one of the things where, like, if I'm asked to be a guest speaker or guest scholar in residence for the weekend, I'm going to find a way to teach this text, and I've preached this text too. A few years ago, I think on the high holidays, I referenced this text. Okay, so we're going to look at it in the Hebrew. This is Pirkei Avot, chapter 5, Mishnah 10. Arba midot ba'adam. Arba is 4, so we're off of 7. Thank goodness. 7 was really hard. We're going to go back to 4. 4 midot ba'adam. Do you remember at the very beginning of today's class, I hope you do, that I said that the Hebrew phrase for measure is middah, keneged middah? God's punishment correlates to human transgression. Middah, measure, keneged, against or for, middah, measure. So midot is just the plural of middah. Midot means measures. There are 4 measures, or here they say types. I would say characteristics, traits, attributes, all good. But measures is the literal translation of midot. Arba midot ba'adam. There are 4 traits or 4 kinds of human beings, 4 characteristics of a human being. Ha'omer, one who says, sheli sheli v'shelcha shelcha. This is really baby Hebrew too, by the way. You'll like this. One who says, sheli, what is mine? Sheli, belongs to me. Sheli sheli v'shelcha shelcha. What belongs to you, belongs to you. Zomida venonit, rather. This measure is benonit, which means in between, average, normal, regular. All right? If a person says, what belongs to me is mine, what belongs to you is yours, that is average behavior. That's the average person. The average person says, what's mine is mine, what's yours is yours. You're going to love this, by the way. If you've ever studied ethics, sociology, economics, this all plays in here. So what's mine is mine, what's yours is yours. That is normal. That is also capitalism, right? Like at the level not of the individual, but of a society or of a way of organizing a society economically. That is capitalism. What I have, what you have, you have. Okay. The next one. V'yeshomrim zo midat sedom. However, there are some who say this is the attribute of Sodom. The Sodomites were distinguished for a number of bad behaviors, one of which continues in the associations we have with a word that comes from Sodom, sodomy, and there is warrant for that in chapters 19 and 20 of the book of Genesis, but that's not what is meant by the rabbis here. The rabbis are not referring to sexual licentiousness of any way, shape, or form. They are referring to the other attributes that are associated with the Sodomites, which are that of greed and hoarding. And that, by the way, may connect this text to the one that just came before it. That the understated theme here is when something really should be shared with the collective, but one identifies it and protects it as oneself. Right? It belongs to me. This is my office. This is my computer. This is my bookshelf. By the way, 95% of what I just said is technically temple property. But okay, what's mine is mine. I would not feel comfortable if Audrey just waltzed into my office and without looking took a few of my books. That's not how it works. They're not hers to take. And I can't do that when I visit her home. I can't take her books either. Okay. So some say that's average for a person to say what's mine is mine, what's yours is yours. That's how people work. But there are some who say that is actually a sodomite quality. To say what's mine is mine and what's yours is yours, that is a thing we associate with the most wicked denizens of the Torah, who were destroyed for their sinfulness. Reading on. That's why I love this text, because it's really easy to read and very provocative, really hard to understand what's being said here, I think. Sheli shelcha v'shelcha sheli. What's mine is yours and what's yours is mine. Okay, I don't know any society that successfully functions that way. Maybe a kibbutz. What's mine is yours and what's yours is mine. Am haaretz. That is the unlearned person. Only an idiot would think that. Only a person who is a boor or a fool would think that we could live in a society where what's mine actually belongs to you and what's yours actually belongs to me. Maybe at a large level, this is the premise of socialism or communism, which we know has worked only ever on paper. The idea of the collective owning everything has never not been abused. It is always abused, so that you end up with people who have and people who do not have. People who have more and people who have less. People who have much, much more and people who have much, much less. Okay. So that is not a compliment to believe that anything that I have is also yours, anything that you have is also mine. No, doesn't work that way in the real world. All right, so now we've had two kinds of people. What's mine is mine, what's yours is yours. What's mine is yours, what's yours is mine. The third kind, sheli shelcha v'shelcha shelcha. What's mine is yours, and what's yours is yours. Look at the word, is a chassid, a chassid. But that doesn't mean a guy with a black hat and pious. It means a person who is pious. The pious one, and this is clearly the one that is elevated above the rest, is a person who says, what I have also belongs to you, mikasa sukasa, and what you have, you retain. I'm not asking for anything in return. I am simply making it clear that out of the generosity of my heart, what I own is also not only my own. That person is deemed to be the best, the pious one. And then finally, the last line, sheli sheli v'shelcha sheli rasha. The person who says what's mine is mine and what's yours is also mine. This is complete dictatorship, right? The state owns everything, is a rasha, is wicked. So in sum, what's mine is mine, what's yours is yours. That is an average person, but some say that is sodomite. We'll come back to that because that's the most provocative line in the whole thing. What's mine is yours, what's yours is mine is a fool. What's mine is yours and what's yours is pious. What's mine is mine and what's yours is mine is wicked. Mary, you had the first hand up, and I think it's wonderful that as a veteran member of our finance committee who's gone on to accept a position on the board, that you would have the first comment here, and we'll take one or two other comments before we conclude.
Isn't the kibbutz, isn't that whole collective system, doesn't that work?
Here's the truth about kibbutz.
Oh, okay.
98% of kibbutzim in Israel, first of all, many kibbutzim are no longer kibbutzim. Like the kibbutz movement is really part of Israel's past and is often viewed with a kind of distorted nostalgia, particularly by people who never lived on kibbutz. But even of those kibbutzim that still exist, 98% of them operate on a capitalist model. There are almost no remaining kibbutzim that are socialist collectives, even though that was the vision. But as Israel went from being a kind of subsistence state to an economic powerhouse, starting in the 70s, by the way, and especially in the 80s, 90s, and the raging economic boom days in Israel of the last 20 years, everyone wants to have their share of earnings. And so the idea of collective earnings and collective responsibility has given way to kibbutzim that are functionally in every way, shape, and form capitalist entities, with some having more and some having less. Yeah. So that's the truth about kibbutz. But of course, the word kibbutz itself, which means collective, says something about the ideal. But like many ideal or idealized societies, they are utopian. Utopia doesn't mean perfect. Utopia literally means from the Greek words u, the letter u, which means no or not, and topos, which means a place, like topography. A utopos or a utopia means a no place, a place that cannot be. So kibbutzim, I view, at least in 2022 Israel, as a utopian kind of society that didn't really exist perfectly even when people thought it did, and does not exist today. Any other comments or questions on this one? I love this text. I hope I don't have to explain why. I think that it's wonderful for teenagers and kids to study, by the way, because it kind of challenges some of the things they're taught, whether it's the youngest grades can, when you learn about finders, keepers, losers, weepers. Well, is it true that what I find or what I have is mine? And again, I think that it's also beautifully, if obliquely, connected to the first two texts we looked at today, because it explores the relationship between the individual and the community. Can one ever really say, or what does it mean when one says, what I have belongs to me? I made this myself. I got this myself. One of the most controversial and both praised and panned speeches of Obama's presidency was the, you didn't build this speech, where he basically talked about how most Americans who have achieved a part or all of the so-called American dream owe their success to something that was built for them even if they're not aware of it. I actually think it was one of his greatest speeches. I continue to read it because I think fundamentally he was right, but it was also countercultural and obnoxious to a lot of people who I think cling desperately to the idea of being self-made. And by the way, to different extents, people can be self-made. I've known some people who come from really abjectly poor backgrounds, and through their own combination of moxie, good luck, ingenuity, smarts, did not have many baked-in advantages and really made themselves into, you know, kind of inheritors of the American dream, have attained wealth, privilege, status, whatever. But many people ignore the advantages that were baked in. You know, it is true, I was a very hardworking student. I took my studies seriously. I always did well academically. I took becoming a rabbi very seriously. And now, by some external measures, I've made it, right? I'm the senior rabbi of a wonderful leading congregation in the Reform movement. But let's be honest here. I grew up in a house with two loving, attentive parents who managed to pay for my college education so that I didn't incur debt until I went to rabbinical school and I took out loans for the first time in my life. I grew up in a house where there was a newspaper on the table every morning and a bedtime story every night. So I grew up in a community where I was not subjected to, violence, intimidation, fear. Even as a Jew, I never felt like opportunity was deprived to me. So I grew up with a significant degree of privilege. And so when I think about what I've been able to, quote unquote, achieve in my life, it's one of the reasons I give back to Hebrew Union College, I give back to my college, but I also believe in public education. I'm a student of public schools. And I also have really paid attention to the way in which I grew up in a fairly white privileged neighborhood. And it set me up for certain advantages in life. So I didn't build everything that I enjoy. Not everything that is mine is mine. And that's my nechemta for you today, my word of comfort, even if it's a little bit uncomfortable or discomforting, is to really do a kind of inventory of the ways in which your own work has gotten you what you are and where you are, and ways in which you have been positioned to whatever benefits you currently enjoy. A little bit of homework. Thank you, my friends. I hope you have a wonderful week. Wonderful 2 weeks. We'll convene again on the 18th. And this session, I'll now end the recording and we'll put it up on YouTube. And by the way, Michelle Braun, what is worse, Wicked or Sodom? You be the judge. I wouldn't want to be associated with either, by the way. Okay. Oh, and by the way, come to Friday night services. We're doing a Tisha B'Av service, so I am going to be teaching in person, or Rabbi Bacon is teaching, and I'm helping to lead the service this Saturday night at 7 o'clock, I think. Look on the website in the tent. So if you haven't met Rabbi Bacon yet, she's wonderful. We have a really meaningful Tisha B'Av observance every year. That's this Saturday night. And then Tuesday night, we're doing a wonderful concert on the lawn with congregants, clergy from both WRT and Kolami. It's going to be awesome. It's our annual summer stage. That's next Tuesday at, I think, 7, something like that. Come, bring a picnic dinner. It's going to be awesome. Just look on the website or on the weekly e-blast. Bye, everyone.
Bye, thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.